Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Vladimir. We have special coverage of former President Trump's impeachment trial. The Senate has acquitted Mr. Trump of inciting an insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th.
It is therefore ordered and adjudged that the said Donald John Trump be, and he is hereby acquitted of the charge in said article.
Just 7 Republicans broke ranks, declaring Mr. Trump guilty of riling up the mob that attacked the Capitol and threatened the lives of lawmakers. Democrats needed 17 votes to convict. President Trump released a statement right after the verdict came down. He took a shot at Democrats, but not by name. He said one political party is transforming justice into a tool of political vengeance and trying to cancel and suppress all people and viewpoints with whom or which they disagree. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer spoke after the vote, condemning Republicans who voted to acquit.
The most despicable act that any president has ever committed, and the majority of Republicans cannot summon the courage or the morality to condemn it.
And Minority Leader Mitch McConnell blasted the former president on what happened on January 6th, but maintained his stance that the trial was unconstitutional.
There's no question, none, that President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day. But in this case, the question is moot because former President Trump is constitutionally not eligible for conviction. Now, this is a close question.
All right, for more on this, I want to bring in our panel. We have Jessica Levinson, Liz Landers, and Molly Hooper. Jessica have special coverage of former President Trump's impeachment trial. The Senate has acquitted Mr. Trump of inciting an insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th.
It is therefore ordered and adjudged that the said Donald John Trump be, and he is hereby acquitted of the charge in said article.
Just 7 Republicans broke ranks, declaring Mr. Trump guilty of riling up the mob that attacked the Capitol and threatened the lives of lawmakers. Democrats needed 17 votes to convict. President Trump released a statement right after the verdict came down. He took a shot at Democrats, but not by name. He said one political party is transforming justice into a tool of political vengeance and trying to cancel and suppress all people and viewpoints with whom or which they disagree. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer spoke after the vote, condemning Republicans who voted to acquit.
The most despicable act that any president has ever committed, and the majority of Republicans cannot summon the courage or the morality.
Challenging the constitutionality of convicting a president or impeaching a president who is no longer a sitting president, of impeaching somebody who is now a private citizen. And Richard Burr, for him to take that action, he'll get a lot of heat back home, but something to consider, Richard Burr is retiring, and so is Pat Toomey, another Republican who voted for conviction. But aside from that, the other Republicans who did vote in favor of conviction, Mitt Romney, Susan Collins, Ben Sasse, Lisa Murkowski, they all, and Bill Cassidy had all been indicating they were going to vote that way. But again, if you ask the other Republicans who decided to vote against convicting the former president of high crimes and misdemeanors, many of them will fall back on the argument that you cannot impeach somebody who is not currently the president of the United States, as Donald Trump is right now. He is a private citizen.
Right, but Liz, I thought it was interesting, the statement put out by Senator Richard Burr, who, just because of his last name, begins with a B, he was the first Republican that came up that voted to convict President Trump. I thought what was interesting about his statement, which is, I think that all 4 of us will agree, because the United States Senate voted in a majority decision that it was constitutional to proceed. Senator Burr's statement really lays bare what he believed his job was and the job of the U.S. Senate, which was not to vote based on the constitutionality, which has already been decided and is now Senate precedent. His job, as he saw it, was to vote on whether or not President Trump was guilty, whether or not the events that took place on January 6th were because the former president of the United States incited those insurrectionists to overrun the Capitol. So what message does the vote by those Republican senators send to the rest of the country?
Well, I think it sends several messages. I think it sends, first of all, this idea that President Trump is the former president, but he may no longer have quite the grip on the Republican Party that we thought. There are a number of those Republicans who voted to find him guilty who are up for re-election. I think what Molly was saying was a smart point, that Burr himself has said he's not going to run again, but there are others who could run for re-election again in the future, like someone like Mitt Romney might be running again for re-election in Utah at some point. So those senators, Collins, Murkowski, Romney, who voted to convict him, I think are showing that they believe that perhaps President Trump will not have such a firm grip on the Republican Party in the future. And also, I think an interesting point that I think that the Democratic House managers tried to make throughout this process, which I have heard some of these Republican senators reiterate, is there is a separation of the branches of government and powers in this country. And for several years now, we've seen Congress losing power to the executive branch, to the presidency. And I think today, for some Republicans and constitutional Republicans who believe in that, they want to exercise their ability to have checks and balances on the executive branch. And I think we saw today that there are Republicans who still believe that.
And still, Jessica, I mean, even though I know the Democrats are probably, unhappy with the decision, but this was still the most bipartisan impeachment vote that we've ever had in American history. But I want to focus a little bit on the closing arguments today. One of the things that struck me in watching the behavior of the House managers and the President's counsel was the House managers seemed to go out of their way to praise the Senate, to talk about some of the historical decisions that were made, that were decided on in those hallowed chambers. And you had the President's counsel who, if you're going by the reporting out there, which is that, the president had a big role to play in how they argued his case, seemed to essentially attack the Senate often. He talked about Senator Tuberville and some of the things that had transpired on the floor of the House and the Senate during the insurrection. And it just struck me, at times that he was scolding the Senate, even in their closing arguments. So what stuck out to you?
What stuck out to me is when it comes to impeachment trials, the first, second, and third thing to know is that they happen in a political forum, not in a courtroom. And so you can have a terrible legal argument. You can have not a particularly great presence. You can be scolding the jurors. And none of it matters because this is an outcome ultimately dependent on political actors deciding whether or not they're going to assess this as an impeachable offense. And so I think that, we saw very different styles of lawyering. We saw the House managers, frankly, do what I think smart prosecutors do, which is flatter the jury. And the House managers, I also think, not just flattering the senators, but in saying throughout their arguments, this isn't a matter of Democrats and Republicans. Vice President Pence was in danger. All of you were in danger. Your colleague Mitt Romney was in danger. And that's why I thought some of those videos that they showed, particularly of Mitt Romney at one point literally running for his safety, was particularly compelling. If you'd allow me to go back for 1 second, this argument about is it constitutional to hold the impeachment, let's remember that it was at that point Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell who decided that we would not hold the trial while then President Trump was still president. We could have held this trial during that term. We decided not to. It was Mitch McConnell who said, we're not calling the Senate back. And then I have to say the vast, vast majority of legal experts agree that it is absolutely constitutional to have a trial once the president is out of office. The Constitution shows that, our precedent shows that, our understanding of our structure of government shows that, and the Senate has now said that. So it is at best bizarre to have jurors who have been told, we can hold this trial, we can be here, say, I know, and even though the question before me is guilt, I'm just going to go ahead and acquit because I actually don't think that we should hold this trial.
It's an excellent point. Molly, let me ask you about the Senate Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell. Part of his statement on the floor of the Senate McConnell said there is no question that President Trump, former President Trump, is, quote, practically and morally responsible for provoking the insurrection on the Capitol on January 6th. He said that President Trump watched happily as the chaos unfolded. That's a quote. Now, if you are not a watcher of politics the way we are, if you are just coming to this cold because this is such a historical moment in our history, and you're reading these words, you're looking at the statement, or you're watching Mitch McConnell wondering who that is, you'd think that he was one of the House managers. He essentially, in the opening statement that he delivered, seemingly made the case for the House managers. But oh yeah, he voted, or he decided that President Trump was not guilty. Explain that to our audience.
Well, it's hard to explain, Vlad, because even as I was watching him give this speech, and I have been, involved in this whole scene for a long time, it sounded to me like he voted to convict. But really, it comes down to this one statement he makes. And again, this goes back to the point of trying a president who is no longer in office. And he said that the President Trump is still, even though this individual, former President Trump, is not eligible in McConnell's mind for impeachment, he's still liable, quote unquote, for everything he did while in office. And now, as an ordinary citizen, he didn't get away with anything yet. We still have a criminal justice system. We have civil litigation, and former President Donald Trump is not immune from either one of those. And to Jessica's point, there had been a lot of questions, and Democrats raised that question about, well, Mitch McConnell said that he wouldn't bring the Senate back in to actually move forward with the trial. But the challenge is, even if the Senate had come back into session, there was only really 1 week before President Trump was going to be out of office. And this process, from the time that those papers came over to the Senate, the impeachment papers came over to the Senate, to today was about 15 days. So even McConnell says Donald Trump would not have been in office when we actually voted on impeaching. That's something that his office kind of put out later this afternoon after Speaker Pelosi was going to town on her Republican Senate counterpart, essentially calling him a coward and cowardly for not moving quicker, and also for not voting to convict, despite the sentiment that he essentially was conveying on the Senate floor.
So let me read part of what House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said, Liz, about Mitch McConnell and his argument that the former president is no longer in office. Quote, on January 15th, the House impeachment managers were gathered to deliver the article of impeachment. They were told that because the Senate was closed, the article could not be received. It is so pathetic that Senator McConnell kept the Senate shut down so that the Senate could not receive the article of impeachment, and has now used that as his excuse for not voting to convict Donald Trump. Again, I'm just trying to get clarity for our audience here. They may not really understand if Mitch McConnell is saying, well, we couldn't do this because it wasn't constitutional, and also if the House wanted to try the president while he was in office, they should have done that. But here's what Nancy Pelosi and what Molly was just talking about, which is that he chose not to bring the Senate back. How does that work?
Right. So Mitch McConnell is a political animal, and he understands the inner workings of the Senate extremely well. And he uses the inner workings and his knowledge of Senate rules to his benefit all the time, whenever he can. So what you're talking about is he was still the majority leader, which is confusing in itself. And I had to sort of reflect on this earlier today, because at that point, the Democrats had won that seat in Georgia on the 5th of January. And there was this sort of long drawn out process before Ossoff and Warnock came into the Senate. Mitch McConnell was still the Senate majority leader at that time, and he decided that he was not going to bring the Senate back from a recess, even though he was pressured by the minority leader at the time, Senator Chuck Schumer, to do that. So that then basically dragged out this impeachment process. And as Molly described, it gave a few weeks for there to be time for the president's team to get a defense team together. But I think at the end of the day, what McConnell did was use the Senate procedures to his advantage, and he is now using that on the Senate floor to describe why he did not vote to convict the president, when I think in reality, if Mitch McConnell had voted that President Trump, former President Trump, was guilty today, I think that could have moved potentially 10 votes, which is what they needed to convict the former president, because he has that much sway over his caucus. But he does what's good for his caucus. And if he thinks they're going to lose seats in 2022 because of this impeachment vote, he is going to take the political path and vote to acquit. And that's what he did.
That's interesting. So, Jess, before I get to you, I just want to ask Molly another question about McConnell. The point that Liz is making is an interesting one, and I don't want to give Senator McConnell too much credit here, but he does play the long game, and he always has. And I know, Molly, you've covered him for quite some time. What if the calculus, one of the things that he said, McConnell did, in his statement on the floor, he talked about possible criminal convictions or criminal charges against former President Trump. What if the calculus by McConnell is this isn't the best way to exercise Trump from the Republican Party because we will just anger his base and potentially bring more Trump-like candidates into the House and into the Senate and possibly continue to be in the minority in 2 years and even possibly in 4 years. What if the calculus is by doing this, we actually prevent Trumpists from overrunning the party in the long term? Is that a possibility, or am I just way off my game here?
I don't think you're way off your game there, Vlad. I think that those are all things that McConnell is taking into consideration, because again, if you look at there are 20 Republican seats up for re-election in 2022. Richard Burr obviously not running for re-election, but his seat will be open. There's going to be a seat in Pennsylvania where Pat Toomey is leaving open. And several others are going to be contested. Lisa Murkowski, who incidentally did vote for conviction, she is going to be running for re-election. I believe, I'm not sure, but Mitt Romney might be up for re-election this upcoming cycle as well. But the point is, and the other individuals who voted in favor of conviction just were reelected, so they have 6 years to do things before they have to face voters again. However, yes, that is a calculation to take into consideration, because if you look at what the House Republicans are doing right now, Liz Cheney, for example, who voted in favor of impeachment, has already been primaried by somebody to the right of her, a big Trump supporter. And what's happening is, there's a Republican in that House Republican caucus conference, Matt Gaetz, who is going into Liz Cheney's district, which is the state of Wyoming, and running against her, essentially, and supporting her opponent. So there's these internecine fights already going on and breaking out over in the House Republicans, and McConnell would not want to see anything like that happen to his own caucus conference, especially since the Republicans have 50 seats in the Senate right now, and for all intents and purposes, there is an even tie in the Senate. Democrats and Republicans. Kamala Harris, of course, as the vice president, can break those ties. But really, Mitch McConnell is within one seat of retaking majority control of the Senate. And he has to listen to those 20 senators, or at least 18 senators, up for re-election this upcoming cycle, and take into consideration what they are hearing back home. And so, again, he's threading a needle here when he's walking a fine line and saying that the president could be convicted of criminal charges or prosecuted by the DOJ, whatever it is. But at the same time, he's still trying to condemn what the president did without actually having to have a vote that he has taken, run against, and used against members of his own conference when they're up for re-election in 2 years.
But I know we're going to talk the legalities here, but I just, Liz, then help me understand, for example, what's Rob Portman's excuse, or why would Lindsey Graham go on Fox News and start talking about, well, I want to know what Nancy Pelosi had to do with all of this? When no one is talking about, you can disagree with her politically, but no one seriously believes that Nancy Pelosi had anything to do with what we saw take place on January 6th, at least not any more to do with it than the former president of the United States. So when you, like, Portman's retiring, or right? He's not running again. What's his deal?
I think that's an excellent question. And I think that someone like Portman and someone like Lindsey Graham are thinking on different wavelengths, to be totally frank with you. But I think someone like Portman, like Richard Shelby of Alabama, announced recently that he's going to be retiring in 2022 as well. I think some of these Republicans are hearing back home that their constituents do not believe that President Trump should be convicted and was responsible for this insurrection. I would say this because I looked recently at Senator Bill Cassidy's Facebook page in the last few days, where he wrote out why he decided that he did believe that it was constitutional to have this impeachment trial, which was that vote that we were talking about earlier that happened on Tuesday of this week. And there were a lot of angry constituents that were writing on his Facebook page saying, I will never vote for you again. You're a Republican in name only, a rhino, which is, an offensive term that some Republicans use against one another. And a lot of angry folks in Louisiana, where he's from, who said that they don't believe that President Trump was responsible. So I think that because the president got so many millions of votes during this election, there are a lot of people who still believe that he won this election, which is not true, of course, but there are a lot of people who still believe that. And I think that there are senators who are hearing a lot of that back home from their constituents right now. I would just add on the point of Lindsey Graham. I think Lindsey Graham is a very close ally of President Trump's. I spoke with the senator in the hallway earlier this week when I was on Capitol Hill covering this. He said he had spoken to President Trump the day before, that Trump was in good spirits. But I think he sort of saw himself as a proxy in this process to defending the president. And as we know, he was in communication with the Trump lawyers throughout this process as well. So I think that Lindsey Graham voting, earlier today for these witnesses, I think that that was a maneuver that he wanted because he wanted to hear from someone like Nancy Pelosi, and they thought that that would be some kind of political win for them. The problem, though, is calling those witnesses, I think, would have opened up a whole can of worms that it seemed like President Trump's legal team was probably not prepared for, Vlad.
All right. So, Jessica, let's dig into some of these legal arguments that were made on the floor here. One of the House manager's main arguments was that former President Trump knew what he was doing when he urged the crowd at his rally to fight. I want to play some of Congressman Raskin's arguments from today.
When he took the stage on January 6th, he knew exactly how combustible the situation was. He knew there were many people in the crowd who were ready to jump into action, to engage in violence at any signal that he needed them to fight like hell to stop the steal. And that's exactly what he told them to do. Then he aimed them straight here, right down Pennsylvania at the Capitol, where he told them that the steal was occurring, that is, the counting of the Electoral College votes. And we all know what happened next.
So, Jessica, I'm going to use that old SNL line that, the late, great Phil Hartman used to say when he played the caveman lawyer. I'm just a caveman. Your world frightens and confuses me. It strikes me that what Jamie Raskin was saying here, what Congressman Raskin was saying is that the words of the president, the steady drumbeat of the words that the president used about the election being rigged, even before the election happened, led ultimately to the insurrection on the 6th. And I asked that question because the president's lawyers seemed to also make that case. They were basically saying, no, this was planned way before January 6th. And so if there was planning that the FBI is investigating, then this had nothing to do with my client. But it struck me that you were basically saying what the House managers were saying. That is their case.
Well, I think, and I don't want to speak for them, but I think that Trump's defense team, President Trump's defense team, was trying to say, well, these people were planning it on their own. So the president wasn't the person who lit the match. an insurrection happened in the Capitol, which they ultimately admitted, and that was terrible. But you can't draw that line between what the president said and what they did. And I think that really was, in part, the crux of what the defense was arguing. Yes, there was a speech. Yes, then later there was this insurrection, there was violence in the Capitol, but we cut the connection between the president and what happened. Now, the defense made some other arguments. You know, we've been talking about whether or not it was constitutional to hold the trial. There were arguments about due process and the First Amendment. But I think that's ultimately what they were saying. And then the House managers did something that I thought was really persuasive, which is to say that this didn't just happen suddenly. There wasn't a rally on January 6th and then a group of people who suddenly decided, you know what would be a good idea? We should go walk to the Capitol. They were primed for this because the president had been saying for months beforehand, the election's going to be stolen. Then the election happens, and he says, look, I told you the election was stolen. And you know what the solution is? We have to stop the steal. We have to fight. We have to fight for our country. And so I think the House managers putting it in context and then showing the videos to add the emotional force was actually quite persuasive. Obviously not for 67 senators, but I think that's the daylight. And I mean, Vlad, to your point, yes, it feels like they're both arguing in a way the same thing. But again, I think the House managers are just saying you can't draw that line between the president and the people who stormed the Capitol.
Did it strike you, Jessica, that that the president's lawyers were slightly overwhelmed by the presentation of the House managers? And I ask that only because when the news broke late last night that the minority leader in the House, Kevin McCarthy, had a conversation with President Trump on the day of the insurrection, and that Trump had tried to attribute the actions of those insurrectionists to another political group, and McCarthy saying, no, these are your supporters, and the president using that language, well, I guess that they are more upset, and I'm paraphrasing here, more upset about the election results than you are, Kevin. And I know this had been reported before. I mean, this was actually not really new yesterday because the congresswoman who had suggested that, Congressman Herrera Butler, had been saying it for a number of weeks. But just that language alone was really, really powerful. And so it was admitted into the evidence. After some hullabaloo around whether or not there were going to be witnesses, and yet still the president's lawyer said, well, we're not admitting that even happened. We're just admitting it into the evidence. Explain that to me and to our viewers.
Absolutely. So as you said, there was some hullabaloo. I mean, we had what looked like a plot twist this morning. Oh, now we are going to call witnesses. We're at least going to call Congresswoman Butler, and she's going to testify about this conversation between Kevin McCarthy and President Trump. And this is going to go against what President Trump's defense says. And, you know, this will open the door potentially to other witnesses. And it looked like, OK, now this could go on for a while. Then I think it was about 30 minutes later, you know, in impeachment years, that can be longer or shorter. But I think it was about 30 minutes later that there all of a sudden is a bipartisan agreement. We're going to allow that statement into the record. And so initially, I think the understanding was, oh, so the President Trump's defense admits that the statement was made and that there's truth to it. And then their response was, no, we'll let the statement in, but we're not going to give it credibility. We're still going to question its veracity. And this is why, looking back on it, and it's, of course, a political calculation not to call witnesses, but this is why, looking back on it, there is a purpose to calling Congresswoman Butler, not just to say we're going to allow your statement to be part of the record, but if President Trump's defense team is going to say, sure, it's in the record, we don't believe it, that's a really good reason to call her before the Senate, to depose her, to have her under oath, and to have her talk about that conversation. Again, the conversation trying to prove what the president knew, when he knew it. And it all goes back to this question, because there's one article of impeachment, incitement of insurrection. Was there speech that was directed to inciting violence? And was it likely to immediately incite that violence? And that's why we cared about that conversation. That's why we were looking at it, to see what the president was thinking and when.
You know, I could talk to you three for like 3 hours, but we only have a few minutes, and I appreciate it so much. Thank you so much, Jessica Levinson, Liz Landers, Molly Hooper. Always great to have you. Appreciate it.